Start my recording. So we can get started. If people jump in, they can catch up. And this is also recorded. So thank you for joining us. My name is Mary Andrews. I'm the Associate Director for the Parent Information Center. Today we have our friends from the University of Delaware's Center for Disability Studies back with another presentation. And today's topic, we are going to be talking more about universal screening and some tips and tricks and things to look out for. So I will turn it over to my friend Nikki, and she will explain more. Thank you, Nikki, for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. Should I just go ahead and drop the slides in the chat box, and then I'll share my screen for you,
Okay.
if that's okay. Let's see. Actually, Christy, can you snag that and throw that in the chat box?
Absolutely.
Appreciate you. All right, let me share my screen. Sorry, it's been a while since I've done anything on Zoom. Make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. All right, are we looking at the slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I see him.
Okay, good. You got a sneak peek of my baby there too. All right, so as Mary said, I'm Nikki Kendall. I'm from the University of Delaware, the Center for Disability Studies. And the reason that I was asked to come share with you is a few years ago now, we did some work across the state at the center helping schools and districts figure out the best ways to identify and implement universal social, emotional, and behavioral health screeners. So my area of expertise, this is a bit of a disclaimer, my area is more along the lines of how do we implement universal, we call them SEB, social, emotional, behavioral screeners. But I am a school psychologist as well, so I know a little bit about academic screening, but I'm sharing that. So if you have questions specific to academics, I might not have the answer to them, but we can find the answer. So let's go ahead and jump into the content. I wanted to start with a screener, so you can put in the chat box or show me with your hand on a scale of 1 to 5. How are you feeling today? So these are, I always use this slide. Oh, you're an 8? I love that. So this is my baby, JJ. He turned 2 on Sunday. So I'm the proud mother of this 2-year-old toddler who I was telling Mary this morning gave me a run for my money getting a shirt on him to go to daycare. So he did end up getting in the car pretty much half without clothes on, but we did get a shirt on before he went into school. So I'm going to give myself a 5 as well, because I feel like I won the toddler battle this morning. All right, so let's talk about screening now that you've done a screening, and I know Wendy you're an 8, so we're doing great. Today we're going to talk about what we mean by universal screener and screening, how we use the data to improve our social, emotional, behavioral, and academic practices for all kids, how to read the scores, and what to do if you get a screener, if one is sent home for you to fill out. I like to start by just framing this with the current legislation around universal screening. So in Delaware schools under a regulation 508, which asks schools to develop a multi-tiered system of support, which just means we're providing good quality academic, social, emotional, behavioral practices for all students. And then we have a good system to follow up with additional supports for those students that need more. Part of that MTSS process is implementing universal screening in the areas that you see here on the screen. So schools need to be thinking about how we're screening or identifying students that might not be responding to our universal practices in the areas of writing, reading, oral expression, listening comprehension, math, behavior, and social emotional skills. I'm not saying we're there yet in all of these areas, but schools are working on it. I also like to point out that there is a difference between universal screening and a universal screener. So the screener is the tool, the screening is the process. So your schools should have a process that includes multiple pieces of information, data that they're looking at to identify students that might need additional support, but also to inform those universal practices. So if they're using a screening process in written expression and they're noticing that there's a lot of kids in a grade that are struggling to meet the grade level expectations, that's an indicator that that's a practices problem and not necessarily a problem that we need to address at the student level. But you can see there are multiple ways that we get that information in schools. So what we're talking about today are these universal screening tools, but schools also rely on teacher and caregiver family referrals. They also rely on things like, we call them early warning indicators. So things like grades, attendance, and behavioral referrals as well. So we're going to talk more about the tools today. The regulations also say when we should be screening. So we need to make sure that all students, all of our students, including our students with disabilities, all students should be screened within the first 4 weeks of the school year. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be delivering a screener to all kids within the first 4 weeks. We just need to make sure that we're looking at all of our students within the first 4 weeks to determine what kinds of supports are most appropriate for our students. So it could just be, meeting in like a grade level meeting, looking at grades and attendance and practices from previous school years, or it could be a formal screener as well. And then those students that are identified as potentially needing additional support because of that screening process that the school conducted, that may result in a second screener. So the first screener kind of catches a wide net of students, or it's supposed to. And then the second layer of screening is supposed to look a little bit more deeply at, what exactly is going on, looking more deeply at the student's history. It could mean an additional screener that is more intensive than the initial kind of wide net that they cast. But again, this is very flexible and is really just designed to be prevention oriented. So let me just pause. And Wendy, you're you're our sole face that I see there. So don't feel like I'm putting you on the spot. But can you think of health screenings that your child or children that you've worked with participated in or have received? So just outside of the school setting, what are some health screenings that your children have participated in?
Well, they do weights and heights and measures
Exactly.
as they go through their years.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. I know every time I go now to my checkups, JJ, my son's name, we do like the CBC. I think they do the checklist every time I bring JJ in now. Height and weight. My husband is always excited that he's at the 99th percentile for his height. So yes, those are great examples. And they're not designed to be evaluative or prescriptive. It's just, a first indicator that, we may need to look into something. In my husband's case, basketball practice for my son, because he has big hopes. So in school, screening tools are like health screenings at a doctor's office. They check for signs to see if there might be risk. Same concept that we're looking at here. So some examples of academic screeners that are used in Delaware schools. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I do know that these are some screeners that schools are using. DIBELS is a big one. that's identifying those early indicators of reading performance. And then MAP screening is another one. Christy, I'm not sure if you're familiar with MAP, but I know we do the mathematics MAP. Are they doing reading MAP too? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, several schools are. Yeah.
Okay. And then some examples of social emotional behavioral mental health screening tools that I know Delaware schools are using. The SABRS, Social Academic Emotional Behavior Rating Scale. That is one that several schools are using, and then PASS, and I apologize, I can't remember what PASS stands for, but that's another one that schools are using to identify SEB needs. Some types of questions that you might see. Here is an example from a screener called the SRSSIE, Social Rating Student Scale. I don't know. Hopefully I'm not being tested here. So just some questions. You can see that these are really broad questions, and the teacher is responding never, occasionally, sometimes, or frequently. Things like in the last week or the last several weeks, how often have you observed the following behaviors? Again, this is going to catch a wide net of students. Sometimes schools have the student complete the screener when we're talking about social emotional behavioral rating scales. So it could be the teacher, like I just showed, or a student could be self-reporting how they're doing. So this is an example from that SABRS screener that I was talking about. Rate the frequency of your behavior. So things like I was distracted or I was prepared to do my work. Again, this is the student's perception of their needs. Very few districts, but I know there are a few schools and districts that are using social emotional behavioral screeners that have what we call critical items on them. And I know a lot of times parents are a bit concerned about this. And in schools that are implementing screeners that have these items, they have a much more rapid response rate to follow up on these items. So some districts are using screeners that include critical items about suicide, self-harm, or harm to others. So if those items are flagged on a screener, a team would follow up within hours, versus if you're using a screener that maybe doesn't have items like that, follow-up could be within a few days rather than a few hours. So if it were me, and I eventually will have a student in our public schools, but if it were me, I would want to just check with the school if I know that they're engaging in this social emotional behavioral screener. I would just do my homework and find out, are there these critical items? If there are, how are you following up with our students or my child if for any reason one of these critical items is flagged, either by self-report or a teacher indicating that they have concerns? I would want to know what the response plan is. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of what we're talking about with relation to screening in schools. What are some sample screeners that are being used? What are the types of questions that might be on a screener? The other question that we get asked frequently from families is, how the heck do we understand these scores when we get the results from a screener? Sometimes schools will send home the results. Sometimes it's one of those, if you don't hear anything, then everything is fine. Either way, I think it's important to sort of understand how these screening tools are developed. And this goes for either an academic tool or a social emotional behavioral screener. So this is just a bit of Psych Assessment 101. So your screeners that are being used, they're measuring how students are doing compared to a sample of children. We call this the normative sample. The normative sample is made up of students that are, or children that are the same age, and they participated in the design of the screener. So when the screener is being developed, the researchers identify questions based on their understanding and predictors of need. Then they use the screener on a large chunk of students across the population. And then that's how they determine those, like, is this child at a low, medium, or high risk, or however they decide to set that screener up. So that normative sample is what we're getting that comparison with. I bring this up because our our children that have disabilities, I think it's important that parents understand that their performance is being compared to that normative sample. It's not necessarily being compared to other children that have the same disabilities. So it's still important that our students with disabilities are included in our general screening, but I think it's important that we're cautious in how we interpret the results. It does give us an indicator about their performance and their progress and the supports that they might need. But I think that's important for us to remember when we're looking at this, when we're interpreting and looking at the scores. So all of these tests kind of are designed to fall in what we call this like bell-shaped curve, where a majority of the students are going to be in that average range. And then you're going to get some students that you'll see a lot of strengths on the other end and areas of need on the other end. So all of our tests are sort of designed to follow that normative curve, and also using that normative sample, with the caveat that some of our screeners, like DIBELS, for example, I know you can use what's called a local sample. And that would be comparing like your child's performance to other kids in the school or in the grade that your kid is in. But for the most part, we're using this national sample to compare student progress. I'm just going to pause and see, are there any questions about this? Okay. Thanks for the thumbs up. So with all that in mind, when you know you're interpreting the score and you're understanding, okay, my kid is falling in the at-risk range in executive functioning. I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there. That simply means that there were a few additional concerns compared to this normative sample, right? That your child might have some needs in this area compared to other kids, because we know all kids struggle with executive functioning, but your child maybe needs a little extra support in that area. But with that in mind, the screener, again, designed to catch a wide net, is not designed to be evaluative. So just because a kid is flagged as potentially needing support in that area doesn't mean that they necessarily are going to go right into an intervention. It just means we need to explore things a little bit more, just like the height, right? If JJ was falling a little bit under the growth scale, it wouldn't necessarily mean that I immediately need to go to Nemours to get something looked at. It just means that there might be an issue we need to explore more, which I always appreciate this picture. It's the same with this image, right? If I take a whiff and I smell something and there might be something going on, I'm going to just peek in JJ's diaper. I'm not going to, go all the way in too deep, too fast. It's kind of a gross analogy, but I think it captures screening perfectly and hits home now that I have a 2-year-old. Okay. With that image in mind, let's move on and talk about, now that we understand how these tools are designed, how they're meant to be used, let's talk about how schools might apply the results to a screener, whether it's an academic or an SEB screener. So first, schools are going to identify which students may need support. So they're going to cast this wide net, and they're going to look at the students that have the most risk, likely like 20% of the students that have the most risk. Again, if it's like 80 students that are at high risk for something, to me, that's indicating that there's a practices problem, not an individual student level problem. So they're going to pick the highest 20% of students that need support. And then they're going to conduct some additional data analysis, right? So they're going to figure out, okay, we've got this chunk of kids that might have risk for this area. Let's figure out what's going on. So that could look like that second screening. So debriefing with the student or the teacher, doing a record review, potentially doing a second screener, which is where you might, as a family member, you might get that screener sent home to complete in this follow-up. Then they'll identify a goal for a change and determine next steps. So they'll use the screener and then that second screen to identify, what is the specific area of need? Is it in fact an area of need? And then what is the specific need that the student has and how are we going to address it? Oops. So this could look like maybe the kid just needs more support in the universal tier 1 practices. So all kids are getting reading fluency instruction. We're just going to give the student a little bit more of that in the general ed setting. Some students might need, like a pullout or a small group to work on a specific skill in reading, for example. We'll keep that analogy. And then some students might need more intensive help. So through the second screening, it might be identified that no, the student is really struggling and it's looking like it's going to be really hard to get them to catch up to their peers in a specific area. So that could mean we need more individual and intensive support for the student. Again, I'm going to pause. Any questions? We're all good so far? All right. I love these thumbs up. It's very reinforcing. So when you get a screener sent home, Mary and I spoke about this when we were talking about this session, and I was a school psychologist and oftentimes was the person sending these raters home. But now that I'm on the other side of things as a parent and even filling out those brief CDC forms at the pediatrician's office, I can confirm that in fact, these screeners can feel a bit scary and personal. Even though we know that our schools have good intent, you might worry about judging your child or giving the wrong answer on a screener, and those concerns are valid. And I can attest to that. There are no wrong answers on the screener. Again, we're just casting this wide net. You can't give a wrong answer on a screener. And just remember that the goal is to really understand your child and to support them in school as best that we can. You don't have to worry about giving perfect answers, even though sometimes it feels uncomfortable. Focus on typical behavior. And again, I just ran into this. There was a question on that screener. Can your child walk up steps 1 foot at a time? And I thought, I know I've seen him do it like once. But just because he did it once, I decided that's not typical for him. So I said, no, he can't do that yet. So really just think about, okay, on a typical day-to-day basis, what am I seeing my child do or not do? And then if you're unsure or uncomfortable, skip a question. You don't have to. You are not liable to answer every single question. You're not going to get a bad grade on the screener if you skip a question. You can ask for clarification. I oftentimes had parents write a question next to an item on a screener, so feel free to do that. And also, if you want to give an example, so if you're not really sure or you want to give more context around your response, feel free to write in additional examples if that's helpful. And then you want to make sure that you know your rights. So your child's rights and your rights with regards to screening. The first is consent. So I do want to touch upon consent. Parents have the right to know the content of the screener. So if you want to know the screeners that are being used, this comes up a lot in social emotional behavioral screening. I, as a parent, I would want to know what the questions are in those screeners, who's filling them out, and what are we using the results for. You do have a right to access the screening results. In general, things like use of existing data or requests for assistance, those things don't require parental consent, but any universal screener does require consent. Now, there are different ways consent is gathered, but consent is required for those for screeners, but things like using existing data doesn't typically require parental consent. There are 2 types of consent that you'll run into. One is passive consent or opt out, and the other is active consent or opt in. So passive consent simply means you're going to get a letter or information that says these are the screeners we're using, these are the types of questions on the screener. If you don't want your child to participate, sign this letter and send it back in. So with regards to universal screening, this is what you're going to see most frequently being used. Letters of notification with active consent. So typically schools that are using screeners with more of those critical items that I described, they'll do an active consent process. So this means if you want your child to participate, sign this letter and send it back in. So those are the 2 types of consent. Whatever the district or school chooses to do, parents need to be provided with an opportunity to give consent for their child to participate in a screener as part of a universal screening process. One other piece of protection that I want to point out is the PPRA. And this is a piece of legislation that requires parents to have certain rights related to conducting surveys in school. So here are some areas of rights that you have here. No student must be required to submit without prior consent to a survey, analysis, or evaluation funded by the Department of Ed that reveals information concerning these two pieces of information. So mental or psychological problems that are potentially embarrassing to the student, his or her family, illegal, antisocial, self-incriminating, or demeaning behavior. So if those types of things are being disclosed, a parent has to be provided the opportunity to opt out of those things. So we can't do that without parental consent. We must make sure that families are receiving notice and an opportunity to opt out. And you should be able to inspect instructional material, excluding academic tests or academic assessments, right? We want to maintain the privacy of our tests used by an LEA as part of educational curriculum for a student. Okay, so just be aware that PPRA does protect your rights in this area. Here's an example of an opt-out example, a sample consent opt-out example. This is actually from a universal screener that a district down south is using. This is called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. As you can see, it's very basic. It says, you know, this is when we're screening, this is the screener, these are the types of items, and you can see that this is passive consent. So parents can opt out if they want to. To opt out, they sign the letter and send it back in. If the school or district doesn't get the letter, then the student would participate. So we're almost actually coming to an end. I expected more questions. So we'll have time to talk about this at the end. But your homework here is to find out how the school shares information about the screeners the school is using, both social, emotional, behavioral, and academics, to find out how the school uses the information gathered from different screeners. So I would want to know, you know, how are you using this information, just to make sure that we're not using those screeners to be prescriptive. I wouldn't want my kid to be part of a universal screener and have them go right to an individual intervention. And then if you have more questions, I would want to know who's my point of contact. So that sample letter that I just showed you should have a point of contact on it. If you're interested to know more about the screeners or how the data is being used, just make sure you know who the appropriate person in the school is to contact. So let's just take a minute to reflect. Was there any information that was new to you? Is there anything you want more information about? Or what did you identify as most useful or relevant to you as a parent? And Wendy, I'm sorry, I didn't even ask what your role is.
So I'm a grandparent.
Oh,
I think that's my favorite role right now. I have a lot of roles, but that's my favorite.
okay. And you're the grandparent to?
A whole host of little children throughout the state of Delaware.
Love that.
I have grandchildren in Smyrna, Lake Forest, CR. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
That's a lot of grandchildren. How many do you have?
Well, I have 8 kids, 6 of which I share with other mothers, so I just collect.
I love that.
Thank you. Right now, I count 6.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking care of our Delaware kids.
Oh, so my question is, are there schools that don't do this? Are they supposed to do this?
I don't have a pulse point on our progress in the last year because I've changed roles, but I can tell you we do a pretty good job with academic screening, specifically in reading. and we've made good strides in math, I think. If you asked me that question 5 years ago, I would say our social emotional behavioral screening is just starting. We've always had things like, requests for assistance and referrals to like support team, at least within the last 10 years. But the use of an actual screener is relatively new. Most districts are on board. I don't know how far along they are, but because of Regulation 508, that slide that with the MTSS regulations, they have to. So they're in various stages of implementation, and we've come a long way.
Yeah. So does any of that screening factor into whether or not a child is identified for IDEA?
So it shouldn't be the sole reason a kid gets referred for an evaluation for special education. It might be way down the chain. It might be something that gets the kid on the radar. But realistically, the school should be reviewing data throughout the year to identify those students more proactively. But the results from a screener can't be the sole way a kid is
Okay.
identified.
So is it a parent's right to be able to go to the school and say, are you using the screeners? Have you completed a screener for this child?
Yeah,
Can I say it?
absolutely. And you can say that I know the regulations say that we need to be screening in all of these areas. How
Do-
are you
do the-
doing that?
Do the screenings help to shape IEPs?
The screeners give kind of, that disgusting visual, right? It gives sort of a broad indicator of areas, compared to that normative sample that the student might be having a need in. But it's not evaluative. So like as a school psychologist, I'll just give you an example. Let's just take I'm assuming you're thinking more along the lines of social emotional behavioral, right? So as a school psychologist, I might give a screener to a whole classroom of kids to help me kind of narrow down which kids I need to focus on more. So the screener might indicate, wow, there's a couple kids in this class that are kind of showing some signs that there might be an underlying need, like some anxiety or depression, for example. It's not going to say that these kids have anxiety and depression, right? Just like the growth scale is not really telling me if there's anything wrong, other than you might want to dig a little deeper into this need. So if I get a kid kind of referred to our problem solving team through the screening process, and we look at the records and we say, wow, there's some attendance needs with the student. The teacher's also reporting that there's some things going on. First we would suggest as a team, okay, well, let's get this student like a mentor, somebody checking in on them. Let's have the teacher implement some strategies for kids that have anxiety. And we do those things. And if those things still aren't working, or if the problem seems like it's intensifying, that could then lead to, okay, well, let's get some more information through like a psychoeducational evaluation. At that point, I would send home like a longer rating scale, like a BASC, behavior assessment scale for children, which, is a common one that our school psychologists will send home to families. I mean, that is like in a perfect world, but I also understand, we have transient kids, we have kids that will come in from out of state, and they don't go through that process, right? That their needs might be so extreme that we're not going to put them through all that because we can see it in front of us now that there's stuff going on. So I think the screener helps focus, but it's not necessarily an end all be all, if that makes sense.
Does it apply to kids with 504s as well as IEPs?
Yep. So all kids
Okay.
should be screened in that school screening process. And again, as a parent, you know, if you're like, "Mm, I think that there may be something going on here. If a school isn't using a formal screening tool, it's still within your rights to say, hey, can we look into this deeper? That looking into this deeper may not be a screener. It could be the team kind of looking at existing data. You know, but a smart school would throw in a tool too, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, so if you have a child that has a clinical diagnosis and is provided medication, and then you're seeing some of the same things, you just go in and ask for an appointment with the psychologist, or
So let me just make sure I understand. So you have a child that is maybe getting outside support for mental health support,
Mhm.
and you want to ensure that the student's needs are also being considered in the school setting.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, every school should have a problem-solving team. I I'm not sure I would go to Christy. It's been a while. Would we start with the counselor, the school psychologist, or would this just be kind of a I'm
Teacher
not
conference.
teacher conference? Yeah.
I mean, I'm a former teacher, so I think it's always a good idea to keep the teacher in the loop. And then I would assume that the teacher would then
Okay.
recommend go to, you know, it might go through the teacher, you know, to get to the school psych or the guidance counselor, however their school does it. You know, it might be different within the schools, but um I
So-
think it would be a good idea to have that conversation with the teacher. You know, what are you seeing? You know, how is it manifested in the classroom? Are you seeing anything? So,
And you, as a parent, you can always request records, data, like
mm,
what data do you have? Are you, like Christy said, are you seeing challenges? If this student has not yet been identified, and you feel like there's a need for extra support outside of, MTSS, then you would reach out to the school and request that evaluation to begin. Um, and then, but the MTSS still would be a tool, even if that student has an IEP or a 504, um, for that ongoing continued like observation, you know, through those areas. Because some of our kids, with IEPs, they may not have challenges, in certain areas like, social, emotional, or math, but it could appear, so that's why we continuously work on those things. Um, but yeah, you always can request data, and compare it to, you know, the information that you have.
Great. Thank you guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
And oh, I should show you. All of our contact information is here. Always happy to chat offline if there are specifics that you want to talk about. And Christy can get you in touch with people at CDS too.
And Wendy, we did do a previous webinar, specifically around MTSS. So I can send that to you if you like it. And it goes into more detail around those processes too. So it'll be a little more helpful, because this was just, about the screening. So some of those questions are answered in that webinar that we did as well. So
I also linked the PIC MTSS document in one of these.
yes.
Yeah, I'm not gonna hurt your eyeballs trying to find it, but there's a good link there too.
Terrific. Terrific. If you could send that to me, that would be
Yes.
wonderful. I
Yep,
appreciate it.
I'll send you that in the follow-up along with the survey from today. And thank you for joining us, Nikki and Christy. Thank you for presenting today, as always. And if you need us, feel free to reach out. And we will be planning more of these hopefully coming up. So
Thank you, guys.
you're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank
Super helpful.
you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. And let me stop the recording.